invite you to Love and Philosophy. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited about this conversation.
So the phrase that's coming to mind here is politics of love from the beginning. And of course, that's from you because of your work. But I just want to say that at the beginning. But those words, politics and love, aren't usually put together. And I definitely don't think we've talked about it on this podcast before. So just, to introduce you to everyone, because you've done so many different things in so many different fields, when I bring up those two words, how can we explore your journey and those two words? Where would we even begin?
My journey in those two words. Well, I found myself in the world of mainstream politics, working in the British Parliament initially, and through what we were doing there, generated interest in other parliaments that took me all around the world, from Capitol Hill to the Sri Lanka, doing walking meditation in the Sri Lankan Parliament, to many parliaments in geographically and culturally in between, and really, yes, of course, guided by a feeling of deep love and wanting to act in service of societal transformation, but also bringing something that I hoped would help politicians who weren't very comfortable with the language of power to start bringing in the language of at least care, receptivity, sensitivity, and discernment that mindfulness and compassion training can bring into one's life and into one's work. And so, to put a bit more detail onto that, I had an instrumental role in a really interesting development in the British Parliament, started around 2013. So teachers from the University of Oxford Mindfulness Centre started teaching members of Parliament, MPs, and peers, members of the House of Lords, mindfulness. And quite quickly, after a year or so, they started to become interested in how this could be shared with others. Like, why don't more people know about this? It was sort of back in the times when mindfulness was still quite an exotic concept, And so I was one of the volunteers and experts that came and helped them to think about the application initially of like secular mindfulness training in different areas of public policy. And I could go on, but I guess that's one of the reasons why politics has been quite close to my professional world for some time, and this deep commitment to inner change, practicing diligently and with expert evidence-based guidance, we now know that quite transformative things can happen for individuals and for everything that they interact with then.
That's wonderful. I think people will be sort of amazed, actually. I mean, for one thing, just to be that close to power is something that fascinates a lot of people, to be really in the middle of government and where things are happening. And you've also worked at the UN, and you've been in these very concentrated areas, which one wouldn't necessarily think about those other words that you used alongside, mindfulness and love. That's already very interesting, I think, to have that there. But how did you get called in as an expert on these kinds of things, on mindfulness? I know you've been working for 15 years or something, as I think the term was like a legitimizing agent. I'm not really sure
Yeah.
What that is, but I think that's kind of what led you to that powerful vortex of people with this, bringing this new thing, which really is not an easy thing to hold in such spaces for anyone, for you, for them, and so on. So how did you end up being the person who was called into that, in that place at that time?
Yeah, it's been quite a ride, and such, I have such a profound sense of gift and gratitude for many parts of the last, like you say, 15 years. The story, I think we can pick up when I was working in climate change, getting disillusioned with the information deficit hypothesis, like many were around that time, and thought, why did I suddenly, start volunteering and then getting paid to work in climate campaign communications? Well, it was my own inner journey that made the same facts land differently, rather than being told any killer stat, And I thought, why aren't we thinking about this? Why aren't we thinking about the inner dimension of sustainability, of the climate crisis, of the bit of the issue which is cultural, which is psychological, and the ways in which we can work with that to shift the needle. And so I went on a bit of a mission to find a role. Initially, I found myself working at Headspace, the meditation app, and my theory of change was simply, help to rebrand meditation and get everyone practicing, because that was what I felt worked for me. I now know that it's a lot more complicated than that. I mean, I think the world would be a better place if everyone did meditate, but it's not for everybody, for good reasons in many cases. And so when I was working at Headspace, I just came across some of the people who are pulling together this policy inquiry on behalf of politicians, helping them to form an all-party parliamentary group on mindfulness. And initially I helped out with the criminal justice bit of the inquiry. And then it turned out I had a real affinity for that policy work, essentially. And so I was invited to be director of the think tank that was formed to support politicians to form this all-party parliamentary group. And I haven't really looked back. That was sort of 2014, 15. And it has really, really flowered into looking at not just mindfulness and compassion training, but inner development more broadly, all the skills and qualities that we can cultivate in order to be more equal to our times, or more able to show up in our lives. And then beyond even in the inner development framing, also thinking about mindsets and worldviews, paradigms, the kind of deep leverage points for cultural change, and lenses like trauma healing and other dimensions of our inner lives that we know now are really important to the health of societies and the trajectory therein of societies. So along the way, I've helped to create policy reports, briefings, and trying to plug this kind of missing middle, we often describe it as, like the grey literature in between academia, which has quite kind of siloed and instrumental evidence, stuff we can measure easily as individuals. Often is much easier to measure individual benefit. And then these more visionary statements from people like Professor John Kabat-Zinn, who was really instrumental in bringing mindfulness into society, saying that there's going to be a global renaissance, grounded in these practices of awareness and compassion. And I think he might still have a point, but that we needed narratives where we could thread together the evidence base in meticulous ways to put flesh on the bones of those intuitions. And that's kind of the bit of the niche, I guess, that I've found myself in over the last 10 years, working in, like I say, broader and broader scope, but really thinking about credible, legitimate narratives, or rather, like I say, being a legitimizing force, taking stuff that's quite fringe and marginal, or even considered woo, or initially sort of career suicide, for politicians. They were like, oh yes, I'll come along to a mindfulness course, but just don't tell anybody. It was strict confidentiality, which changed significantly over time, and you couldn't shut them up talking about it, like even on the front page of major newspapers. So that's...
Yeah, this is really fascinating to me. Even, I don't know what you might think about this, but where you were, I mean, it's almost hard for us to go, that's like 10 years ago, where it was really hard to talk about a word like mindfulness in these atmospheres, and it's much easier now. But even you thinking about when you were doing climate, or when you were focused on these other issues, the way you sort of set it up there was like that was a outer or outside or physical, or whatever way we want to think of it, kind of activity, and that you started to realize it's not only that outer world, it's actually the transformation is somehow in the way that you're aware of your own self, or how can we kind of get into the messiness of that a little bit, of Because I think that's related to the change that happened even in, the way that now we can talk about mindfulness, because in that legitimizing, there's something about the way we've separated something like climate and something like our human lives, or something like mindfulness and something like politics, that feels like it's changing, but we don't really articulate it yet. So can you help me understand how you started to see that relationship differently?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, many of your listeners, I assume, would be familiar with integral theory, the work of Ken Wilber. And it's amazing to me that it's been 30 years since he proposed this kind of like very simple 4 quadrants. You have like x-axis, y-axis, inner, outer on one axis, individual, collective on another axis. And you get these 4 quadrants of like roughly psychological, cultural behavior and sort of collective systems, for the, and we're starting to see that human systems involve all of these things, all of these dimensions, interwoven and co-arising and conditioning each other all the time. And back then, I had that intuition without being aware of the work of Kim Wilber or any of this great, body of work more broadly that's been done on this subject. And I guess my preoccupation there was the psychological change that I had made, and therefore changed the direction of my life, and thought other people could make that psychological move. And now I realize, that is so interwoven with culture, and you can't put the emphasis on individuals, etc. But I mean, these things are so interwoven. Actually, it breaks down how much sense it makes to actually talk about separate quadrants, or like inner being different from outer.
We confuse that, don't we? That we're trying to understand it, we separate it so that we can understand it, because it's just everything and so much. But it's not actually broken down into those parts.
Well, that's the case for all concepts and language and tokenizing the world, which is the nature of it is kind of beyond all that. But particularly when there's something totally missing from our thinking and from our discourse, it's very helpful to have quadrants, to have names for things that have been neglected. And in the introductory segments of the system within, addressing the inner dimensions of sustainability and systems transformation, that is a paper we put together for the Club of Rome last year. We have a whole section on Enlightenment thought, scientific revolution, Descartes. It's just a page or two, but it's, we didn't feel we could go on to try and address this missing inner without pointing out how unique this period of history perhaps has been, that it has been increasingly exiled from public discourse, from science, to the extent that behavioralists in the psychology that I was taught in university are almost like denying consciousness, that we were denying the evidence of our own experience. So yeah, I've gone on a philosophical journey, I guess, and discovered that there's many others who've been thinking deeply about these things and going on similar journeys. And I've seen my job, legitimizing this whole space, get easier and easier. Like we've got traction, changes being made, language can be used that couldn't be used before. And so, yes, now we're having these conversations in the White House, or at least we were before November last year, and across, UN and other places, where it's okay to talk about consciousness, even if we're not really sure what that means. For instance, the UNDP Conscious Food Systems Alliance, which is a really interesting development I've been sort of supporting over the last few years, which was founded on the guy who's in charge of food and agriculture in the UN was just like, we're not shifting systems. I've been trying to do this for 30 years. We're not seeing the change anywhere near deeply enough as we want to. We need a consciousness shift. But what does that mean? Like, I think that's right. But we need to work on articulating that, like having a kind of a more legitimate conversation. And so again, he pulled together experts, much like we had in the British Parliament, together to kind of think through how we frame this. And now it's grown into an initiative which is funding grassroots inner outer transformation projects with farmers in Egypt or executives in Mondelez, all these different levels. So yeah, it's great to see this evolution.
What do you think is, since you've been on the inside of it and you've actually seen it with individuals and with groups and with yourself, how do you think about this? You call it an intersection a lot, I guess, or this, but it feels very dynamic. This, I think it has to do with attention and awareness and this legitimization almost. It's okay to talk about what we've termed inside as connected to the outside. If you're working with politicians, for example, or even when you're working with yourself, that area I think is so delicate and so easy to make fun of, or to feel like we're going to be made fun of when we start looking at that relationship. That I almost, right now I'm thinking of it almost like as a kind of like a spinning wheel or something, where what's on the inside is coming to the outside and the outside into the inside. And when we kind of stand at that place or surf that place and try to talk about it, it's such a vulnerable space. How have you noticed or found that you or others are able to be in that space differently? Or
I have to say, I think I initially underestimated the desire or ability for people in these mainstream contexts to go straight there. And just what comes to mind is the time I invited Dan Siegel into Parliament to talk to a group of politicians. And Dan Siegel is a psychiatrist, interested or has background in neuroscience as well, and writes a lot about children education, but also has a book called Intraconnected and some more stuff that's a little bit more far out there. And he came initially, I thought, to talk about meditation, and he talks about the integration and differentiation in the brain being sort of like characteristics of healthy systems, but then he went like way off the deep end, and I was sort of metaphorically biting my nails there in the kind
what does
of
that mean exactly,
like,
way off the deep end for me?
well,
You just started
he
talking in esoteric kind of ways or something?
kind of esoteric ways, but like, talking about like, the language of consciousness, the language of sort of more pointing towards the phenomenology that we all share, even talking about like God and the nature of mind, and his own sort of theories about quantum consciousness and
Not something you see in political, or pretty unusual to go there in political spaces.
Yeah, exactly. And I thought, oh my God, you've lost it. Or like you've burnt some of our relational capital with these people. Like, even though this has been years into the parliamentary program by this point, and politicians are very happy just to get up and walk out of the room. I've had it where someone says the wrong phrase or something, talks about social justice, and you lose 2 or 3 conservatives who's like, oh, this is one of those conversations, I'm out of here. But no, they stayed, and then they asked for the room booking to be extended so the Q&A could go on for longer. And it was like I don't think we lost a single politician. But yeah, they wanted to spend another 20 minutes, another half an hour in the room with him, because he was giving them space for something that often we foster, these intuitions. We have private conversations around dinner parties or in corridors, and we often don't have spaces where we can really go there and talk about the interaction of the inner and outer, and using some of this out there language. And it helps. Dan comes across as a very sort of credible figure, and I think it really matters who holds that space, who has that message. And what we heard about the mindfulness program more broadly, and this was really interesting, is that politicians felt that over time they developed relationships with other people they knew had been on a mindfulness course and had different sorts of conversations, brought in more of themselves into the parliamentary context, more of them, transmitting and receiving on more channels, or like bringing more of their person into that professional realm. And not just that they were modeling different sorts of conversations that those who hadn't been on the course would kind of adjust to. They'd join a conversation where more was within limits, I guess, within allowable scope of discourse. And they pointed towards this potentially being helpful or leading towards culture change within the political establishment. And we put the findings from semi-structured interviews and some of the anecdotes that we'd heard into a document called Mindfulness in Westminster: Reflections from UK Politicians. And so that's there's latent desire there, I guess, in a way that I hadn't appreciated.
Yeah, it's almost like you really tap into what we're all hungry for. Maybe even what's the source of politics itself, in a way. I mean, it's, if you really think about what we're trying to do, isn't it connect with one another and explore potentials that we can't understand, which are very much connected to consciousness and all of these things that it's almost because it's so important, is why we haven't talked about it, because it's that vulnerability or something. Does that make any sense to you? Have you thought about that?
It does make sense to me. I mean, it doesn't resonate in the parliamentary context that I experienced. I had a self-selecting group of politicians who had been on the course and then were interested in really exploring it further through policy. And some of them, connected within that container, and they found that remarkable because of its contrast to almost everything else they did. And that often people, come into politics, and it isn't just like parliamentary politics, but the body politic, as activists or campaigners or whatever, often driven by feelings of deep love and imagination, a kind of imaginal idea of what you think society should be like. But then you get kind of rigid and ossified around a particular program or a plan or a party, and you're not still acting from the emergent future that needs to come through. You're not acting through desire to connect or whatever. Actually, there's a desire to win out over the other party, and often out over people within your party in order to get more influence and actually be able to have.
Mm-hmm.
So you think more power, although if actually you talk to ministers and even people in the cabinet, often they feel quite powerless. So actually what I saw was a great level of disconnect and suffering around that. And you often see this, I think, in examples of on the left and right, people who are still acting out a political program, but aren't acting out of love. They're acting out the kind of the power and the ideas that they've taught themselves is the right way to go. But in the cut and thrust of actually trying to get that program acted on, they lose those original impulses and that feeling. Because it's, this is one of the reasons why I'm very interested in power and love as a potentially a dichotomy or something that is held in tension with each other. Is it's very difficult to continue holding the drive for power and the drive for love at the same time.
That's exactly what I was trying to bring up, is that, I mean, in my experience with people that I've met in these worlds, they seem to have, there's different ways to come into it. Some just want the power, or they want to be seen, they want to be important. And I don't think that's disconnected from actual, love, actually. Not that there aren't extremes of it that are unhealthy, but then some come in, and the way you said, they really want to change the world in a good way, or they see something that hurts them in the world and they want to help it. And the messiness that I feel like you've probably seen, that I want to learn from, is how it seems that can get so corrupted so easily that almost, I don't know if it has to do with the way that we've created these systems. I mean, you've written about systems in a new way, and part of what you've been doing is sort of starting to change those from within, right? Through talking about the inner. But what is it like? How are we doing this anyway? Like, we come into these systems, political systems, wanting to do what good, a lot of us, and then the system itself, just to survive it, we sort of have to narrow something in a way.
Yes.
That tension feels really important to me, and I don't really know how to get a good grasp of it. Have you gotten a better grasp of it as you've been so close to it?
Exactly. And that's kind of where we started this conversation. It's just like, how can we help those in power who feel like they have been truncated in some way, to open up that greater rate, that scope of sensitivity, sort of receptivity, care, to bring more of themselves into that role. And, Carl Jung thought that actually both of these drives couldn't be operating at the same time in the same breast, that at best you oscillated between them. I don't think that's the case. I think particularly with spiritual practice, it's possible to show up.
Or even if it was the case at some point, I mean, we're trying to move towards holding those together.
Yeah, exactly. But like, it's rare, and
it's rare, but isn't it so powerful? I mean,
when you see it,
there's such power in that for all of us that we haven't even begun to explore, in my opinion.
Exactly. In mindfulness training, often teachers say that we're trying to develop the ability to be strong in back and soft in front at the same time. That means that we have the kind of the rigor, the diligence, the discernment, the ability to show up and be clear and decisive with your mind, but at the same time being careful and compassionate. And that relationship internally then enables you to express that better, that sort of balance better externally. So it's, you train the mind like you train the puppy. You say like, no, puppy, you can't be over there. You really need to be here. It's decisive. It's clear. But also you don't kick the puppy. It doesn't know any better. You're kind with it at the same time. And this shows up in a number of different philosophies and sort of cultural backgrounds. I'm minded of like the samurai Bushido code, feudal code, talked about like rectitude and uprightness, but also compassion. And yeah, it's a powerful thing when we see it. Martin Luther King, of course, is very famous for talking about love and power. He did his PhD thesis on Paul Tillich, the theologian, who also wrote a lot about love and power, and that's one of the reasons that comes through in Martin Luther King's speeches. And he said, power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. And so we need, one needs the other to be effective rather than being degenerative. Because we're very familiar with the degenerative side of power, of course, of the many ways in which it's obviously reckless and abusive.
I think you're onto something that's really, really powerful in this. What I'm trying to understand too is this it's not about sides, actually. Gosh, let's just try to be messy a little bit, but when there's this amazing power in connecting and in feeling the inner that can also be redirected to something negative in the same way that the outer can be redirected to something negative. There's something about this ongoing, I keep thinking about this will, right? Where, what really matters is somehow the presence as you're doing this, because some of this conversation is still like linear, as if we're going to get someplace and then we've gotten there. If you teach meditation and mindfulness, then you've accomplished something, but that's not actually what I'm seeing in your work. That is kind of the point. So
yeah, I can definitely pick that thread up. So we're very familiar with the ways in which power can be reckless and abusive and degenerate, and we're less familiar, at least in some cultural circles, with the ways in which love can be limiting and degenerate. So there are helpful, healthy expressions, but also if we tend to say need love because it's a defense mechanism to be a people pleaser. I know that one, particularly in my 20s, can really restrict your choice making, your sense of individuation. You can be passive or like attracted to submissive peace in order to not ruffle feathers, displease people, and a drive to unity, which doesn't appreciate the necessity of individuation, differentiation, healthy boundaries, a sense of identity within those boundaries. Like you need boundariedness in order to have a sense of like, a sense of identity that underpins collaboration and sort of healthy tribalism. You know, we are inescapably tribal creatures, and how can that be shaped in a wholesome way? You know, and also if you express love sort of too much without the sense of power, you can lose your own self-individuation, which can be disservice to you, but also to the world, because power in some ways is kind of sacred. You know, it sort of underpins this, our ability to create our to channel our creative impulse into the world, to offer our soul's gift, you know, whatever it is, to be guided by Eros and to shape and create. And there are some people in the world who are hyper agents. You know, Elon Musk has often talked about one, you know, and he can just like create new companies, shape the world, buy whole media ecosystems, and enact. And if we aren't developing our own ability to do that, to sense what is wholesome and follow that impulse into the world, then it's a great disservice to us and to the world more broadly. So love, I think, you know, whatever your weaker capacity is, I think we need to, you know, one needs to develop either that strength in back or that softness in front. And there are ways in which, if now we need to legitimize love as a political force, as an allowable public message, then we don't just need to explain why love is also structural, why love is also, you know, profoundly transformative, but we need to work at not discrediting it. And we did the same thing in mindfulness, legitimizing mindfulness. We had these like, you know, solid policy reports. And also we kind of worked with the mindfulness sectors to help them nuance how they were talking about it. So they weren't continuing to be, in some cases, their own worst enemy, and putting people off it or giving a too shallow a rendering of it. And in a similar way, I think those of us who would be guided by love could show up in the world and talk differently about love in a way that doesn't discredit it, and doesn't make it too woo, and, you know.
Yeah, and isn't part of that holding it as almost a dangerous kind of thing in the way that you sort of touched on before, in the sense that all these categories we have of good and bad and all of that, you know, we tend to put love in the good category or something, but it's actually much more powerful than that. It's beyond those kind of categories, and we don't, like, that's hard to hold. And I think part of really bringing love into this in a new way is there's almost it's almost, you know, you're walking the razor's edge a bit when you're really feeling that. So that makes me want to think about Eros a bit, because you brought up Martin Luther King, and that he's usually talking about agape. And even that distinction that we make, you know, we put love in those kind of boxes so as to, like, necessarily, I think up till now, so as to get a grasp on this, you know, powerful force that is holding us, or that we are. But maybe we're starting to also realize that Eros isn't quite, you know, how we put it in that box. It's not just sexual, for example. And that there's, you know, I'm almost thinking of a tantric kind of feeling here of something that's not sexual, but that we're trying to begin to feel into together. No one person could handle that alone, which, you know, kind of gets into this too. So I don't know, what does that bring up for you in terms of love, I guess, it's and how, because that's also not an easy word to bring into any of these contexts, and
Yeah.
much less to talk about in a different way than like rom-com love. So how does that, how have you held all that space?
Yeah, I forget that Eros, in many people's minds, is still very much bound to sexual desire, because I come from a relatively new practice tradition called soul-making Dharma, or at least that's one of the threads of my personal work. And that talks a lot about Eros in very sort of broad terms. And Eros is any, well, it's the creative force that's in everything. Like as soon as you start to be framing it in that way, you see every act of will, every sort of intention, every image or, you know, sort of deep motivating analogy or force all has, you know, Eros woven through it. By which I mean this sense of wanting to move towards something, to, and then there's slightly sexual and like language, but it's not. It's sort of like conceptually to move into something, to penetrate something, to be suffused by or penetrated by, just wanting to kind of become closer, to be more intimate with. And that can be this idea of, say, you've never been to California, but you've seen all the commercials, you know, like from the tourist board, and you have this sense of like what it's going to be like to be there, and you know, all the mythos around Hollywood or whatever it is, and so you want to go there, you know, you want to know it, to nuzzle up against it, you know, like um to explore, to be intimate with it. And that force of Eros is a world creator. You know, it's a fundamental generative force in human nature, and perhaps in reality, in the cosmos. And so familiarizing yourself with that, bringing the discernment and the clarity that can come through meditative practice and contemplation, to understand the forces of that within the heart and mind, and to work with it in ways that shape it in wholesome and productive ways, is, yeah, tremendously powerful. And yeah, is a way in which love is a form of power, like to see that generative potential.
Yeah, it's almost like that. I think of it as, you know, you're sort of on the portal looking into what we don't know what's possible really if we can learn to hold that. But also, as you were talking, I was thinking in one of the reports, maybe the systems, I'm not sure, but I think you talk about how at some point after going through, you know, so much research into collapse, I think you were studying collapse and what's sustainable and what is resilience, that at some point you just realize like the only thing you can really talk about is love. Does that relate here at all? Like how did how does that, how do I hold that concept with this way that we're talking about love here?
Eros, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I spent much of last year working on what I call the inner dimensions of societal resilience, and occupying the future, like you say, like, and from that place, I felt like, you know, resilience isn't enough. Just getting through isn't enough. Like something deep within me wanted to just fully go there and talk about like, what are we doing here, guys? What do we love enough to put ourselves out of this nosedive? Only that is a big enough conversation and a strong enough intrapsychic force for us to be able to overcome the fear and the hatred that happens when you're in a time between worlds and certainties collapse, and helps you to move towards a different vision of how things could be. And part of that is Eros, yeah, like that kind of like moving towards an imaginal future. And part of it is sort of, yeah, I guess, love, appreciation, Eros for humanity, and it being, you know, or civilization, and it being worthy of saving. But personally, I think when I talk about love, I'm also talking about some kind of cosmic divine force experience, um, that I sense in my deepest moments, which has no object. Eros always has an object. And there's always a two-ness. There's always a me and a you, or me and an it, or a thou. And I want to move towards it. Like it's got beauty, it's got mystery, it's got, some things attracting me to it. But there's also this kind of background, it feels much more like a background field, like a background radiation of just beneficence, or like, a desire for things to be well, which hasn't got that quality at all. There is no object of it. It's much more diffuse. And in my more mystic moments, I have this sense of a divine other, God, ground of being, fusing with my own love, my love and well-wishing for others, all becoming sort of indistinct, and there's that sort of two-ness breaks down. And that sort of love, I think that the mystics of many different traditions, Sufism, Christianity, and others, talk about that sort of love a lot. And where I am at the moment is that it is in some sense an ultimate reality.
Is that we can't speak of, that we try to speak of in a way. But as you were talking, I just had a talk with Parker Palmer, and we were talking about, when things are really hard, when you're depressed or something. And we talked a bit about love maybe being what's holding us even when we don't feel it. And that just sort of came as you were saying that. But also what came was the idea of faith, because in your writing, you also talk about how we don't necessarily have evidence for love, which I think relates to this more logical kind of side of us that wants to have evidence and studies and so on. And I know that's a big part of your work. You're doing a lot of studies and data and stuff. And that's also part of the difficulty of bringing love into these environments because of this word evidence. But as you were talking, I was also thinking of that. Is it Hebrews, where faith is the evidence of things unseen? Or I'm probably not saying it exactly right, but that feels really potent here too. Of course we need data and we're trying to understand, but we're also, something's holding us, which of course it's holding us, so we can't fully have evidence of it except that we are part of it. Or I don't know, this is a bit messy, but what does that bring up for you?
I mean, what it brings up is actually something very recent and timely, because I had, it might be disclosing too much here, but I'm a big fan of a particular form of a sort of hybrid body-mind therapy called Rosen method therapy. And it works with some real sort of like primary shapes in one's psyche in a way that I won't go into particularly because I don't totally understand it. But it is like, it is well worth checking out. Let's put it like that. And I experienced yesterday this part of myself that desperately needed to develop trust, like trust and faith that it will be held, that all manner of things will be well, that letting go and letting myself become a more and more emergent force, and that my own, that sense that I'm being moved through by a world that wants to move towards the wholesome, is the kind of edge of my practice, and that this session yesterday was really helping me do that. And this could be understood actually as a kind of a bit of a macro pattern over time, that the more I have let go, the more I'm able to create positive change in the world, the more powerful I seem to become in what I'm hoping to do and help with. But the degree to which I let go and allow that to happen is dependent on the amount of trust or faith that I have developed, that is kind of evidenced by by life, like by having done that, exactly to your point. And so
That's powerful.
so I think it's iterative. I think you have to maybe start with as much faith and as trust as you can muster, let go, see what happens. And there's a way in which the world, I think, will win your trust. And in the same way that perhaps you win the world's trust as well, and perhaps, I don't know, enables you to be more effective. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm getting off the deep end myself now, but
No, you're not. I think it's actually exactly the right place to think about all of this, because it's nested. All that we've been talking about is nested in that. It's because, we're talking about it with you and your communication with yourself. But we could also I was thinking about the story you told earlier of the politicians who were sort of finding community, and how realizing there were others around them who were also feeling this way or able to talk about this, or, I think that's a similar, like, nested pattern to what you just described. I mean, and what's happening between us and the world. Do you know what I mean? We're helping each other maybe to be able to do what you just described on an individual level, but there's a way in which that's not separate from what politics of love might be, in a really practical way, at the same time that it has that really deep, off the deep end quality to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I really like the sense of it being nested. That there are ways in which you can put your toe in this water, or experience the thin end of something, and have deep experiences of the same thing, and that the conversations that we're having in Parliament, are
or the groups that have helped you learn how to meditate. I'm thinking of Jamie when he's maybe in his 20s, and I think you were working in advertising, and wasn't this still sort of that pattern of you starting to trust that you could look inner, that's now kind of blossomed into this whole other career? I mean, it doesn't feel like that would be something completely different from this, or if I'm even remembering that correctly. But
and actually there's the big change maybe that I had in my 20s was what Robert Keegan, the Harvard professor, might call the movement from the socialized to the self-authored mind. And that I was really running the code that I had absorbed from society's values, from my family upbringing, and what I thought a good life looked like, and where happiness and satisfaction would arise. And the break from that, the realizing I could just leave this career that I worked really hard to get into, and take my own route, become a Dharma bum. Essentially, I kind of like went to Barcelona and with no employment and meditated. It was great.
And just for those who know, you were sort of top ad executive. Is that what?
Yeah, I was.
You were kind of at the top of the ladder of the
exactly.
corporate
I
world.
wouldn't say I was top of the ladder, but I was running a global advertising account. Like
that's
I was
pretty top.
At one point, I was responsible for $1 billion brand. So yeah, I did. That briefly.
And then you became a Dharma bum.
And then I became a Dharma bum. Yeah, and I remember that being a big psychic move, and Robert Keegan's work points to like sort of 5 orders of consciousness. You say, like, first 3 very, very common, like basically level 3 is the socialized mind. That's the minimum level for a kind of healthy, sort of somewhat realized adult that you might, But then after that point, it's just like the authority for what a good life looks like becomes internal, rather than getting this code from external sources. And yeah, God, there's a lot of faith you had to have to break from that, like no income, break from that whole story. It's a big move. It's not I mean, I'm still very much scientific materialist, certainly didn't have any comfort with talking about the divine or the sacred, or this sense of like letting go and trusting the universe. Like that would be way beyond. But there was a sense of having to trust myself. Although I did read a book called Synchronicity in that time, which is a well-known sort of a book, again, a kind of a corporate executive who self-authors, and then discovers that by trusting, weird stuff happens, like synchronicity is maybe a thing, like,
Mm-hmm.
and that was
That's
actually
kind of what I mean, that we're helping each other with these messages. What you're doing now, and even this podcast, someone might hear it in the same way you heard that in your 20s, right? It opens up a possibility.
Right. Yeah.
In the same way that the meditative practice can open up a possibility. I guess I'm just trying to get at how all these are sort of nested into each other. And when we think about something like politics of love, and we think about what you were going through then and how it's nested into where we are now, I wonder, it might be too big, but to really think about what's going on right now in our societies and to us as a world, it's something's holding us and we're trying to learn something. I don't know. Can we think of it like that? Or do we risk becoming
that's
Yeah.
That's one of the ways I stay sane. Yeah.
Okay.
Thinking about it like that, my frequent co-author, writing partner and life partner, Rosie Bell, and I put out a piece called Between Optimism and Despair, the Messy Middle Paths Through Climate Collapse for DeSmog last year. And we sketch a number of potential pathways for civilization, for society. Not to say these are the only pathways, but to try and open up the range of pathways we think about, rather than we're just going to, just about do this in time, or it's hothouse Earth and the end of
these
Mad
extreme
Max time
scenarios.
But there are pathways in between, and one of those potential pathways is that it gets really bad. Like there's a level of systems failure that we can't quite comprehend at this point, but that's almost required for the lessons that we need to learn. The mindset shifts, the mental models that need to shift require that discomfort and that suffering, to put it plainly.
It's like the crack, that.
And you don't wish it on ourselves, but yet there is reason for thinking that might be the case, that we are needing to learn something. And the Zen master is asked, when do people learn? And he said, when they have to. And we don't have to yet in individual lives. That isn't felt in the most powerful parts of the world anyway. So yes, there are ways of talking about this in quite kind of academic terms, about paradigms and deep leverage points for change, and some of that quite academic and mainstream, increasingly mainstream way of talking about it is also woven in with the language of mindfulness, and in Otto Scharmer's language, the needing to have an open heart, an open mind, and an open will, and touching into a kind of a ground of potentiality where the emerging future can be allowed to arise. And so, but there's also this other way of talking about it, which is about evolution of consciousness, and that being interwoven with a world that, in some way, we've got it backwards, and maybe consciousness is primary. Not to deny the importance of what we currently, think of as consensus reality, and that some things are real and others are not, in some ways, but that consciousness is primary. That there's something weird going on with it that doesn't match up to Western scientific understanding of causality, and perhaps there's something in there where we're being invited to learn about too.
Yeah, is that also like a sort of fulcrum in a sense? Because I often think about, kaleidoscopic cognition or constellation thinking, or trying to understand self and our own consciousness as more of a multiplicity, which, as you were talking, I was thinking, okay, for some people in the world already, the disaster, that scenario you described is their daily life. They don't even have time to talk or think about all of this stuff. So in a way, we're responsible for doing that. Like if we start thinking of ourselves as multiplicities, or even of consciousness in a way that we're here to share and open one another up in kind of the ways we've been talking through this almost dialectical process, does that become a sort of fulcrum of what would be politics of love, a shift of our awareness of what is possible in this, conscious, this sense of what I think you mean by consciousness, or, how do you see that?
Yeah, well, some people are like, well, we need a new religious movement. And some people think we need greater capacities for imagination, that we need to sort of work more actively with the clay of the public imaginary. And that touches on interdependence with nature and into some of these territories of faith and consciousness and reality, absolutely. And I'm thinking particularly of the work of my colleague Phoebe Tickell and Moral Imaginations on the one hand.
You also wrote a paper together, didn't you, or something?
Yes, she was a co-author, exactly, on the system within. And that might have limited appeal, however, because there are many existing faiths, and there are ways in which some of them those faiths might contrast with what the kind of spaces and approaches that, say, new religious movements might invite them into. So I think we can have a politics of love which speaks in spiritual terms, which is to say, it brings in what is most important into the public discourse. It really goes there about some of these primary shapes and colors of that are existential in nature, but doesn't have any particular truth claim woven into it. And I'm as I was saying things before, like, this is new territory for me to go on record with, talking about what is and isn't happening in relation to God or consciousness or the ground of being or whatever, however you phrase it, because we need a politics of love that isn't grounded in truth claims like that, but invites a discourse that is happy to talk about love as a civic force, or in fact, there's this phrase civic religion, which is to say, a religion actually is kind of atheistic, or but it's possible to think about love of one's country, wholesome patriotism which bends towards justice and international collaboration, which works with love, whether it's through national anthems or plays or statues in public spaces or political speeches, other forms of art, that this is something of to acknowledge this is something of a spiritual project. This can't be purely a secular, dry thing. And the right is much more comfortable with generating strong emotion, with talking about or using some of these primary colors, and have been much more squeamish about it on the left, and that's been a serious imbalance. The work of Jonathan Haidt and others pointing towards the fact that liberals are only communicating to some moral taste buds, whereas the palette that conservatives use is much broader. And that's partly because faith is part of their project, much more explicitly so.
Yeah.
But how can we, rather than just being ecumenical, as in having a coalition of different faiths, talk about something which is unifying in some way, and that's to say, not a particular ontological belief or claim about the existence of God or our relationship to them, but to say that love and these deep questions of what is important and how we should relate to each other, what is a skillful and wholesome way to live, should be part of our political discourse. It has been sort of banished from the public realm, and whereas I think it was Gandhi who said, we want our systems to be so good that we don't have to be. And that's something like the project we've been involved in. We haven't had a conversation, deep conversation about values, about who we really want to be as a people. Instead, it's been a focus on systems which we've been shown now are just ideas, and people can just contravene them when they choose. We're just seeing that fiction that our systems will be enough evaporate.
I wonder about the advertising side of this. I mean, it keeps coming to me a bit that we're all at different places, in all of these ways of talking about what we're talking about, whether it's the politics or the love, and feeling it on different levels and be able to express it at different levels. And I remember someone way back telling me about environmental issues or climate change that was going to have to become like trendy or cool or something before it made a difference, which it actually kind of has in a way. But I wonder about that side of it. I wonder about that side of it, which I think relates back to where we were in the beginning of how this can be easily manipulated too. There's a place there that I'm always trying to understand that I think relates very much to the way we try to find a sort of place where this is going to catch on and people are going to get it across many different spectrums, and how when that happens, that becomes that power, that portal opens, and there's so much power that the people who know how to shift it can use it in negative way, like, ways that aren't wholesome, to use your language. And that feels like something we need to talk about too, but or notice that we haven't really. So I wonder, you've seen that from a lot of different places, and I wonder what that brings up, or what you might have to say about that.
Do you mean how love in particular could be misused, or like sort of these energies?
So if we're talking, a politics of love, right? That already feels like a paradox, which for me is a powerful thing. If we can hold that, we can open up a lot. But I can also see how even we can see right now how things that were considered self-help or mindfulness 20 years ago have actually become ways that people with traditional power right now, they use those ideas and methods towards just kind of keeping the more general mood, believing that success and power is what they tell them success and power is, if that makes sense. That kind of create your own world. What I say is true as long as I say it enough mentality. And I wonder in 20 years if a politics of love couldn't, with very good intentions, end up in something like that, just because of this this way that we are all, trying to get this from different levels at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think any new movement, any new idea needs to be alert to ways in which it could be co-opted or go awry or be misinformed. And I'm a big fan of the work of the two philosophers who write under the pseudonym Hansi Freinacht. And they have a book, The Nordic Ideology. And in that, they propose 6 domains of a new politics. And one of them is essentially the politics of the evolving developmental conversation about how the rest of the other 5 could go wrong and be co-opted and be damaging in the long term. I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. They have one of the 6 is like basically bringing the inner into discourse, really focusing on the psychosocial as an area that has been so little intervened upon that it's so little intervened upon that it's discounting a whole area of action that could be really effective very quickly. So there are many ways in which it can be warped, for sure. I wonder, this wasn't quite what you're asking, but I wonder whether it's helpful to think about power in the context of modernity. So like I see the modernist project really emphasizing agency and power and our ability to create change out in the world as being what is strongly valorized. And then with the critique of modernity coming, postmodernism through the 20th century, power becomes sort of projected out there and denied within postmodern spaces. Then activists, communities, and people in the kind of postmodern left, where love is more valorized, sort of relationship, connection, um, prioritizing justice, healing, and reconnecting where things have been disconnected, partly through indigenous worldviews and really helpful, wholesome wisdom traditions like that. But that perhaps it's either gone too far, not being comfortable with its own expression of power, not being comfortable as an individual stepping forward and being within power within those spaces is very, very common for power to be in shadow. And that one of the reasons we struggle to see what a politics of love could be is because we are some of us are so within and sort of saturated with that critique of how power works and how the modern system is causing us untold problems, and that actually we need to explore the middle way between those two, which is what I see that metamodernism, or like this post-conventional, postmodern sensibility to be. It's not the step on from postmodernism. It's sort of a kind of an adjustment where the pendulum swung away from that kind of modernist sense of like we can discover things in the world and create it, we can build and fix, and we'll be in this single linear trajectory of progress, to this critical, relative and sort of aloof sensibility. And for us to swing back halfway through and to be okay with, the Greeks called metaxy, that kind of like that something that's like beyond and through the dichotomy of those two, is a place where the politics of love makes sense. But unless you swing back, power is either only seen as destructive and oppressive, or love is seen as woo-woo and and actually this conversation of power and love, although philosophers have been talking about it for time immemorial, it's some helpful folk language for us to be able to talk about inner and outer. Like power is often thought about as outer and love is often thought about as inner, but also talk about this middle way between modernism and postmodernism, and between what is sort of really real and held to be objectively true in modernism and this sort of paralyzing relativism where things are kind of like subjectively real only. And that actually this also chimes with Buddhism and the sense of middle way between existence and non-existence being the nature of things, emptiness, and that yeah, there's a sensibility here which I'm, as a sort of a kind of card-carrying metamodernist, maybe it's no wonder that I'm sort of feeling into this in between.
That's exactly where I was trying to go, because we've brought it up a few times, but yeah, not clinging to one side fully, even though that can be the way that we start to feel the power of it. Like I think there's something about joining groups and feeling the power of it that can then lead us into getting kind of rigidly on one side. And I really like what you just said, and I agree with it. But I've started to think like middle way. Yes, I get it. But we were talking about what's holding both, right? And part of me lately in this whole holding paradox beyond dichotomy isn't. I wonder what you think about this. I've started to realize it's not about choosing one or the other or solving it somehow or convincing one part of the other part, which I feel like even if we don't say it, that's often what we're trying to do. From one side, we're trying to convince the other side. And that feels to me like that energy has become, it's not that we want to be a middle in between those energies. Instead, we want to let those energies be and explore what's holding them. I don't know if that makes sense, even in terms of climate and people, or inner and
Totally.
outer, or,
Yeah, and this is where I get really excited about how my experience of meditation practice, of insight, there are different ways of coming at this, sort of exploring it from the angle of interdependence.
And intra, you brought that up a few times, but yeah.
Right, yeah. And or the kind of insubstantiality of things, as Buddhists might frame it as primarily often. That there is there's a way in which, yes, we can oscillate, from one pole to the other, and that's one helpful way maybe of understanding metaxy or middle way. And there's another way which is really drawing on the analogy from quantum physics of superposition, of things being possible within a probability field, almost like a stack. And this is why I think Carl Jung was ultimately wrong about, not being able to have power and love in the same moment, because, and it might be a characteristic of a post-conventional mind, that you can hold paradox better because you're not collapsing things to real. You can hold them as even weighted potentials. So like, maybe I'm a 60% panpsychist, or whatever the philosophical term would be for the what I was talking about earlier in terms of this intuition around the nature of consciousness and reality. But I'm still at least 10% scientific materialist. And actually, I really like Christian mysticism. I like the language and the image, and I have only in the last few years really increasingly found a place in a more theistic way of rendering things. And it's not like I swing between these. It's like they're in a stack, they're in a superposition with each other, and they're all sort of influencing how I show up in the world and my intentions and sense making and discernment. And certain conversations I have will sort of like upregulate or make one or the other more likely to be impactful and shape what I say and do, but they're all kind of there and operating. And it's that tolerance with ambiguity, is that tolerance with there not being one answer, and being okay with the mystery around around all of this. And it's not to say like it's true because quantum physics showed it or whatever, where it sounds kind of similar, but it is helpful that we inevitably scaffold our understanding of ourselves and the world based on what we know from physical sciences. Newtonian physics has been shaping and limiting our thinking for centuries, and now actually quantum physics is offering us some new analogies for how things could shape, could be. And so yeah, superposition of different ways of looking, I think, is one of the things that gives me hope, and points towards, again, the importance of inner development and being able to have the kind of mind that can hold that complexity.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's very powerful, and I agree. Knowing that things can be a particle and a wave, and probably many other possibilities, just having that as a understanding, and that's now become something most people understand, is so helpful as a step towards being able to hold that maybe in one particular situation, whatever you've learned from the literature that calls itself panpsychism will be more helpful for you to understand that situation. And in another one, maybe it's going to be even Carl Jung. Maybe in another one, it's going to be what you read in the Bible,
Totally.
Like, to be able to it's not even a percentage, even like I'm this percent of that, because that already says there's like one whole, but actually
Right.
all of those situations are different layers in the stack, right? With different regularities, and naturally, maybe wherever you are, you're going to need different, the particle or the wave. So I really love that. I think that's a new way of thinking, that we're from many different areas all trying to get our get a way to explore together. So, and I feel like that's what you're doing with the politics of love. I don't know if you
Yeah.
would agree with that, but it does feel like that space is opening.
Yeah, I think it definitely is close to all of this. It's an important part of all of this. I'd like to coin a term, if I may,
Please.
that it's been said that there are different forms of metamodernism. This new, initially artistic, then philosophical, now sort of political movement. At least 3 or 4. The part of it that Hansi Frohnach is associated with is a kind of developmental metamodernism, which is like we need to be deliberately developmental in all these different aspects of human systems, and particularly within the psychosocial domain, so that we can better deal with the complexity of the world that we're facing. And I would like to point towards ontological metamodernism in the way that we've just started talking about here, which is this sort of real, not real. The fact that people, the kind of artistic sensibility of metamodernism is sort of playful and serious at the same time, ironic and sincere, because I think it understands something about the shadow play going on here, and the kind of like we need to take this deadly seriously, and there's an as-ifness in any particular view, or provisionalness, or the fact that it's just one part of the stack. And that I think notions of ontologically, there's always a way of operating, and that things don't, concepts and things don't exist from their own side, without that sort of way of looking, brings us into a metamodern sensibility, and perhaps a metamodern sensibility will give us insight into that. And that's what kind of fuses together, to some extent, my Buddhist background, my political aspiration for society, and this emotional sense of their needing to talk about love. I think it all
That
comes together
legitimizing.
somewhere in that nexus.
Yeah. That brings us, I think, in a full circle to where we started with the legitimizing agent, but also it opens it up and kind of explodes it in a way to where, yeah, we can sort of start to hold it all a little bit differently. Actually, I think that word, or these words, even meta, and it's almost like instead of thinking of it in a binary way, we're starting to realize that meta goes in many directions. It's not up and down linear, and it's not only one. And there's a dynamic movement going on there, which is maybe what this ontological is, this beingness. So yeah, I like that term, and I'll just let it like hang open. Usually at the end of these conversations, I ask people about love, but we've been talking about it the whole time. So I should ask you about philosophy probably, but you've been talking about that too. So just to kind of close down or end it for now, I wonder if you have any experiences with love or philosophy that, come up now that you want to share, or anything, related to any of this that you feel like you want to share or express before we go for now.
Yeah, I want to say thank you to my dad, who is a philosopher, not professionally, but he got introduced thought experiments at age 13. How do you know you're not a brain in a jar? How do you know that any of this is real and not just inputs into a thing? What's the nature of consciousness and reality? And I've spoken on previous podcasts actually about how I've been on a kind of spiritual journey and went from being scientific materialist to now feeling like the world is re-enchanted and soulful, and feeling interested in divinity and sacredness, and contrasted that with the kind of what my dad gave me in kind of like negative terms. But actually, yeah, being brought up essentially as a philosopher and an asker of questions and lover of learning is an enormous gift that he gave me. And so I'd like to say thank you, Cam.
That's beautiful. That really holds the love and the philosophy, because, this holding you in love and out of love, sort of letting you be a philosopher. I almost think that's the place to start with everything we've been talking about, in a way, whether as a parent or as just someone who cares about another person or in the world, to be able to do that, to have that space held for you, or to have someone help you do that is just, yeah, it's so precious. So thank you for going there. I didn't expect that at all, and it's actually the most beautiful way to think about what we've been talking about. And thank you, Jamie, for all you're doing and for pushing to these edges with yourself and with others.
Thank you so much for this inquiry that you're on, and for making space for this conversation.
All right. Bye.